Honoured guests, sponsors, colleagues, I welcome you all to the 67th Annual Conference of Local Dental Committees. I hope you all agree that the opening session of conference has been interesting and we've considered a number of issues which have sparked great debate. Apologies really, Eddie, for bumping you off the microphone earlier, but so I grew up a few miles away in East Belfast through that era known as the Troubles. Only the Irish can come up with a term seemingly innocuous, describing a conflict which cost so many thousands of lives. Like that other T word, suggesting something colossal, yet that vessel succumbed to a lump of ice which was even more titanic than it was. So I left to study at the University of Leeds, not only to get away from the conflict and the politics of Northern Ireland, but also it was the only place that accepted me. But I come from a family who've been very active in local politics, with an uncle, a past MP for West Belfast, a father who helped to establish the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland, and a mother who's with us tonight, who recently served as Deputy Lord Mayor of Belfast. But I'd had my fill of all the politics and the issues surrounding growing up in this part of the world. So how the hell am I standing in the Europa Hotel addressing you lot? I still blame Dave Cotton. But I'd like to go on with a few thank yous. To the Agenda Committee, Tony Jacobs, Alison Lockyer, Stuart Allen and the money man Will Newport. They've given me considerable support over the last year, and most notably in the choice of venue. Taking this UK conference outside of England for the first time, never mind out of Britain, was a gamble worth taking. In particular, past Chair Alistair McKendrick and next year's Chair Vijay Sudra have provided invaluable help in helping to arrange the motions in some sort of presentable way. Henrik Overgaard-Nielsen has also been encouraging and reminds me often that conference is there to hold General Dental Practice Committee to account. Thanks also to Nick Stoltz and other past chairs of conference with whom I've sought advice, and it's great to see a number of them here this evening. Fiona Feltham from BDA Events team seems to have relished the challenge of organising conference in Belfast. On our visit to the hotel in February, she noted that nothing seemed to be a problem to the Europa staff. Everyone seemed to have solutions rather than problems, and Fiona even suggested that we could even consider coming back in a future year. But she's a true star. Thank you so much, Fiona, for all the hard work. Recent past chairs of conference will agree with me that the person who really takes the pressure off is Alex Tenich. Despite working in BDA policy and being involved in all sorts of committee business, she gave me the impression that chair of conference was her sole priority and that no request was ever too much bother. Many, many thanks, Alex. Thank you also to our sponsors this evening, to Simply Health. They sponsored this evening's dinner and the conference, and thanks once again for giving that support. Finally, a word of gratitude to my old friend Callum Youngson for agreeing to be our guest speaker this evening and see if we can bring some wit and levity to the proceedings. A past Dundee undie, that's not an item of clothing, but an undergraduate from Dundee. He lectured me in Leeds about all things white and sticky and restorative dentistry at Leeds Dental Institute. His lectures in glass armour cement were epic. He also spoke at my graduation dinner some 30 years ago, come December. And I think the dust is now settled, Callum. But he departed Leeds for Liverpool and worked his way up to Dean of the Liverpool Dental School. And that's both of us bluffing our ticket pretty well. But seriously, Callum has always sought to provide the best of advice and support for his students as they set out on their professional career. So why Belfast? On eventually being elected in Manchester, Nick Stoltz, Fiona approached me, introduced herself and told me that my first task was to agree a venue for conference. Gulping, I suggested going back to Manchester. Well, it was an easy choice because that's where I was elected and it was a great venue. Harrogate, because I live and work in Yorkshire, it's a recognised conference venue. And then, tongue-in-cheek, I said, have a look at Belfast. The first agenda meeting came. Manchester, Harrogate and Belfast were all quoted for, and the hosting costs were all very similar. A 2-day meeting in London was to be exorbitant, but Belfast might have an edge, as airfares would often be less than train fares the length and breadth of England. But I do feel it's in a UK conference, recognised in standing orders. I reminded them, since 2006, conference has all been very England-centric, with the focus on UDAs and English contract reform. The Northern Irish and then the Welsh support for conference has been dwindling for many years. Scotland, of course, have their own annual conference they hold in Stirling, but they continue to send a contingent of representatives to join us, albeit half of them are Irish. But it's great to welcome David McIntyre and his colleagues to Belfast. They really looked after VJ and myself a few weeks ago in Stirling at the Scottish Conference of LDCs. Thank you so much, David. So the Belfast idea snowballed, and by April the Agenda Committee affirmed the Europa Hotel Belfast. Alison had heard that the shopping and the restaurants were outstanding, and Tony had already booked the ferry to get his golf clubs over. It was a done deal. So last year I promised to chase up those LDCs who had not attended conference in several years. And I'm glad to say many of those have answered the call and are among us this evening. I also put out a call that we have a conference more representative of our profession, and it's really encouraging to look out and see so many more female delegates and so many more younger faces. Thank you all for your support. I thank Peter Crooks and latterly Richard Graham for their support when I suggested we come to Belfast. I hope that the Northern Irish LDC members are getting a positive taste for the proceedings and that they realise that they can have access to a national platform to discuss and share their issues. And more often than not, your issues are our issues. Excessive children's GAs, regulatory issues, delays in annual funding uplifts. But more specifically, there's a shortage of dental nurses in the province due to changes in the responsibilities for their education. With the GDC mandate that all dental nurses should be registered, this is making recruitment and chairside assistance very, very difficult. But in fact, I'm starting to hear from areas like North Yorkshire, this is becoming a cause of concern as well. Then, I'd never been to Cardiff before. I could never get a ticket for the rugby. Have I mentioned the rugby yet? I thought there would be a bigger cheer from the Irish at least. Katrina Clark was very keen that I visit and try to impress on the Welsh LDCs the value of attending conference. I understood that there was the criticism that it was considered a very English affair. So I assured them that I would endeavour to develop an agenda which would appeal to each of the four nations. Contract reform was always going to be fundamental to this conference. But considering Welsh Chief Dental Officer Colette Bridgman's work initially with contract reform in England and latterly with the introduction of an oral health assessment in Wales, which encourages more delivery of prevention, the Welsh have an important part to play in conference. So tomorrow, my aim to get all four Chief Dental Offices to attend was another cornerstone to reinforce the point that it is a conference which should appeal to each country. Simon Reid from Northern Ireland, Margie Taylor, Scotland, Colette from Wales, and Eric Rooney, Deputy CDO from England. No, he hasn't been promoted yet. But despite an assurance from Sarah Hurley that she would attend if I managed to get the other three, Sarah recently told me that Eric was much better briefed on topics up for discussion and there would be a more suitable person. I did agree. What can we learn from Design to Smile? in Wales and Child Smile in Scotland to make starting well in England better than it currently is. If Scotland and Wales have prevention as a major element to their oral health improvement plans, why can't England? If we do manage to get a dental contract reform package that is workable for patients as well as for those delivering the care, Northern Ireland might have a look at it and see if they can find a way of improving on their contract, which is still following 1990 conditions. We will hear from Ben Squires about the Devo project, which devolves health and social care responsibilities to the Greater Manchester Authority and how dentistry works within this. Is this something that's going to be rolled out in other areas of England? What can we learn from already devolved countries and the issues that they face in commissioning? Michael Donaldson will give the Northern Irish perspective. So, to the main event, contract reform. The evaluation report came out a couple of weeks ago. And St Michael's dental practice is but a little dot on one of the graphs. But there is a lot more to that little dot story, as there is to every prototype story. And I'd like to just give a little bit of illumination to that. So go back 70 years ago, Nye Bevan had a dream. It was of creating a national service which provided health to all, free at the point of delivery, based on clinical need. 50 years ago, Martin Luther King had that famous dream, where one day his nation would rise up and live up to its creed, that all men are created equal. Unfortunately, he was unable to see that dream fulfilled. Then 6 years ago, I had a dream of just what might be possible in the brave new world of NHS dentistry under the pilot. And so it was, in September last year, I sat down with my practice manager of some 28 years to set out what we needed to do to hit our practice targets. UDAs were on course, but we needed to take on an additional 450 patients before the 31st of March. At that, she turned to me and said, "That's it. I've had enough. I can't take this any longer. The dentists are at their wits' end and the nurses are threatening to leave. Long-term patients are complaining every day at how long they have to wait for appointments. I just can't do this anymore." She still had 5 or 6 years left before retirement, and she left us in December. So how did we arrive at this point? The point where a highly respected, experienced and valued member of staff had finally said, after 28 years, "That's it, I've had enough," and resigned. We go back, I read Options for Change cover to cover many years ago, and I was depressingly impressed. Impressed that it was a comprehensive body of work, depressed knowing that the government would never pay for it. Some of their conclusions were, there is an absence of vision and strategic thinking in NHS dentistry. Unless there is a fundamental change, the future of NHS primary care dentistry is uncertain. Another conclusion was any new system of service delivery would need to be incentivised, financial and otherwise, and presented effectively to the profession. This was 2002. So my practice embarked on the pilot programme in 2013. Every member of the team was committed to the development of a more preventive approach which would improve the quality of care in which we delivered our patients. We were a successful practice. We achieved our targets year on year. We understood that the programme wanted to maintain access levels and that there was no new money available. We were promised that we would be no worse off by participating in the reform programme than had we remained on the UDA contract. We were promised that we were developing a new, more rewarding way of working, like we were trained to do, and get away from that treadmill of drill and fill. But, first of all, we were required to upgrade our IT so that we could use the practice software. It cost us £26,000. No recompense. We were given baseline figures of those patients that we had seen in the last 3 years. Access, they termed it, and as well as minimum required clinical time for NHS care. We had no idea of the relevance or veracity of the patient numbers, so we ran with it. So we geared up to start on the 1st of April 2013. Appointment books were altered and to accommodate a 20 to 30 minute oral health assessment. A mammoth task. With 6 weeks' notice, we were told by the reform team they wouldn't be ready until the 1st of June. No patient, though, could be seen without an oral health assessment. Whether routine or emergency, each assessment involved over 100 keyboard clicks per patient. The red, amber, green risk assessment score for each patient had to be explained. We had to justify where patients were in amber or in red, what they can do to improve their situation. We then set about arranging the treatment plan with appointments for therapists, dentists, and associated treatment prescriptions. So immediately a 10 to 15-minute recall appointment became 30 minutes minimum appointment. The contract reform team told us it would take us some 9 months to get through all of our 11,500 patients. It took us almost 2 years. Meanwhile, from the 1st of April, not the 1st of June when we actually started, patients we hadn't seen for 3 years started dropping off. But we had no time to take on new patients in the first 18 months. We barely had enough time to provide the treatment immediately necessary for existing patients because we were spending so much time doing the oral health assessment for everybody through the door. So at the end of year 1, we had lost so many patients and we suffered the maximum 2% contract or clawback. We suffered the maximum 2% contract value in clawback, some £14,000. Year 2 saw the last of the initial oral health assessments, and we started to provide more treatment to look to take on some new patients. At year end, we suffered a further £14,000 clawback, but we're still working our tails off. Year 3, 2016, saw us focus trying to make up the numbers of patients, and by 31st of March, we were within 150 of the target. We still suffered a £2,500 clawback. Sticks in your craw, this clawback, doesn't it? But we were making a difference. What was that difference being measured? At the outset, we had engaged an additional therapist and trained our nurses in fluoride varnish application and oral health education. The skill mix was working, but it was requiring additional surgery time. Our books were crammed with existing patients. You take the 55-year-old who comes in, say every 6 months, comes in, first thing he says, oh, my teeth are loose, why are they loose? I said, well, you smoke 30 a day, you don't brush your teeth, and you don't see the therapist. Usually he'd say, oh, well, that's fine, walks off, you see him in 6 months' time. But you give him an oral health assessment, a piece of paper where he's got a red mark on there, why am I in red? Because you smoke 30 a day, you don't brush your teeth, and you haven't seen the therapist. Where's this therapist? People began engaging, our existing patients began engaging with the process. By this time, most of the participating practices access had dropped alarmingly for the programme, and our activity had gone through the floor as well. But was it any wonder? We were working away, doing what we were supposed to do, but it still wasn't good enough. Worst performers were discouraged from continuing the project, and a number of new practices were invited to join as Wave 3. They renamed these practices continuing as prototypes. The UDA was reintroduced as the reform programme thought we were underperforming. They did not even have the imagination to call it by another name. This was the single most issue to which contract reform was looking to find an alternative. Introduced in 2006, the UDA system was deemed not fit for purpose by 2007. It is riddled with perverse incentives that potentially corrupt the prescribing process. It works against those with high needs, and as my friend and colleague John Milne has often said, those with the greatest need are the least welcome in an NHS practice. So we now had 2 targets to achieve from April 2016, access and activity. But the rules had changed. Department of Health and NHS England decided to rejig the access numbers. They took out any patients who had been seen on an occasional basis, which resulted in a decrease in our access target of 160 patients. The numbers of patients on our list were recalculated also, and one might have thought that it might have been a commensurate reduction. But no. As I said earlier, on the 31st of March, we required a further 150 patients to meet the target. The following day, we required 504 additional patients. an overnight increase in our target of some 350. This is increasing access by stealth. Not only did we have to start doing more activity, but we had to see a heck of a lot more patients, with appointment books already filled to bursting. Routine treatment had to wait 3 to 4 months before we could see them. Simple restorations risk requiring root fillings or worse extraction by the time you got to see them. At evaluation events organised by the contract reform team, practices complained that we were experiencing difficulty in achieving this access. We were met with recommendations such as not to carry out interim care appointments, extend recall periods beyond those recommended by the software. In other words, abandon prevention in order to see more patients. No recognition whatsoever was made of the fact that we were taking on so many more new patients, often with greater clinical need than those that they were replacing. And by November 2016, I decided that the only way we were going to reach these access targets was to take on an additional associate. Working 3 days a week to see just new patients, we increased the NHS clinical time, which we were originally contracted to provide, by 22%. The cost of this came off my bottom line and cost some £50,000 last year, not including the additional nurse and the clerical costs. Eddie asked the question, how did you do it? Had my wife not had an orthodontic practice within the same building, we couldn't have afforded it. But I was determined to make these damn targets and illustrate quite clearly how much it actually cost to achieve them. I know of many practices out there which supplement prototype expenses with other earnings. And we were not supposed to be worse off. Stresses within the practice were getting to such a level that we were considering withdrawal because we simply couldn't tolerate it any longer. Something had to give. I met Helen Miscamble last July, my first attempt in asking her to attend conference. Our chat went on to how we were doing, and yet again I told her that access issues were a serious problem. She told me that NHS England set the access figures, and it was out of her hands. At an evaluation report meeting in Leeds last September, David Roberts of NHS England was present, and I asked him directly what they were going to do to improve the situation, and most especially the access issues. He said, and I quote, "This is the only show in town, take it or leave it." This is not really the progressive reply I had hoped for. At LDC Officials Day last December, Ankur Denoya asked the contract reform team what they were going to do to improve things for Wave 1 and Wave 2 practices who still struggled to achieve their targets. Hamid Butt replied in his own inimitable way, nothing. Contemplating leaving the scheme, I wrote to Helen Miscamble inquiring to what improvements were going to be planned which might sway our decision. She had acknowledged the email and promised a fuller response in time. I'm still waiting. A meeting with our associates concluded that if there was not going to be any improvement in conditions, we would be forced to withdraw. But we agreed that we only would go out having achieved the target. We were not going to be seen as a failure. During the 2 years as a prototype, we had to take on some 1,700 patients to make that 504 shortfall because of the drop-off after 3 years. But I can tell you, we did indeed hit those access numbers, and we exceeded our UDA activity in March of this year. We have now left the process, and many ask, why are we returning to the UDA system? My reply is always, we were in the UDA system, we've just dropped the access target. It's like the story of the Emperor's New Robes, a brand new reformed contract which still has the UDA, increased stress levels and longer waiting times. I've told you what it cost in IT, clawback and additional staffing. But what value would you put on a practice manager? The first pilots were established in 2011-12, and we were promised that the new contract would roll out in 18-19. In my mind, we're nowhere close to achieving that. And if this is not Department of Health, NHS England underperformance, then I don't know what is. Ministers, secretaries of state and governments have come and gone since we started this. Chief dental officers and chairs of General Dental Practice Committee have come and gone since we started this. Only Helen Miscamble at the Department of Health has been constant. Constant in her presence on the contract reform programme and constant in her intransigence and refusal to allow changes to produce a dental contract fit for purpose. She, like us, is paid from the public purse. But who carries out her annual appraisal? Who asks her whether she's delivered or not? What amount of clawback would she be due, I wonder? So have you any solutions, Joe? Well, really glad you asked me that. A high level of capitation seems to be the best way forward, and the budget seems to include enough money for both, and the budget needs to include enough money for both prevention and the necessary treatment. But there is a limit to how many patients a dentist can safely look after. Any reform contract must therefore look at the length of the registration period and the ratio of the dentists to patients. This might vary depending on the oral health standard of the communities, as well as the capacity of the dental practices to provide that care. In an ideal world, the money would follow the patient, allowing good practices to grow. The Department of Health are afraid that the budget would go up if this were to happen. Well, so it would. But if increased access is desirable, it must be paid for. It's not acceptable for the dental budget to continue to fall in real terms year on year. They have a measuring method for prevention in the form of the Dental Quality Outcomes Framework. It is an innovative system which, with more work, can show the effects of a more preventive approach. It's certainly a start. But rather than using it as a stick, whereby it accounts for 10% of the contract value and another way of gaining clawback, why not add it to the contract value? Make dentists work harder to improve quality, but reward them for it. In Wales, Colette Bridgman is trying to develop contract reform with prevention at its core. The Health Minister, Vaughan Gething, supports this and is providing over £2 million to try to make it work. In Scotland, Margie Taylor has recently announced the Oral Health Improvement Plan, with prevention clearly on the agenda. The Cabinet Health Secretary, Shona Robertson, addressed the Scottish LDC Conference a few weeks ago and promised further financial investment where appropriate. Northern Ireland also recognises the need for contract reform, and Michael Donaldson has written a paper proposing to look at the outcomes of the English process. Good luck, Michael. And Northern Irelandise them. Now, only in Northern Ireland can you have a term, Northern Irelandise something, but I understand what he means. Dentists here just need the politicians to see some sense, sit down, form a government, and oversee the darn thing. Theresa May said that there was no magic money tree. Yet she found £1.5 billion to garner support for her government from the Democratic Unionist Party. I honestly hope, though, that this money is spent effectively in Northern Ireland, as it was hard-earned by all of the people across the UK. So I began talking about two people who had had a dream, different dreams, but when they became a reality, they changed the lives of millions of people forever. 10 years ago, Professor Jimmy Steele had the dream that dentists should be more accountable for providing high-quality care and long-lasting treatments, and take the time to advise patients on prevention. His review was responsible for the contract reform we see today. Unfortunately, he too did not live to see his dream fulfilled, as he sadly passed away last year. There is an enigmatic line of a song about ordinary people. Is a dream a lie if it don't come true? Or is it something worse? I think it's asking whether it is right to dream of a better future when times are challenging. Maybe we should not raise false hope only to be dashed, because the powers that be won't allow it to happen. But I disagree. For without dreams, how can we move forward and improve? We must keep pushing on that door to a better future, no matter what it takes. Let us all do what it takes for a better dental contract, which works for our patients and for our colleagues. And let this be the legacy for Professor Jimmy Steele. Thank you for listening.